Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We're now on week 8, and we're moving into plot, scene, summary, story, and flashback. So have your story ready, or have an idea of what you think your story might be about. We've, covered character and imagery, so I'm hoping that you have an idea of what you'll be writing about, or if you started your story, that's great. And this lecture will help you plot out what will happen to your protagonist. Okay, so have a pen and paper ready as usual, and I would like you to quickly outline your story. Maybe set a timer for 3 to 5 minutes. Don't take too long. Okay, we're just, getting ideas out. You may not even know yet what's happening, protagonist. So a free write is good to just, throw some ideas out. You might also already know, right? You have it figured out. So please write a brief outline of your story. Okay, what are the main events in chronological order? Is it important for readers to know past information that happens before the events? Where will those details be revealed? Okay, how much time passes from the start to the end of the story, and where does that time happen the fastest? So you can just do like a timeline, what happens this point, this point, this point, as it moves forward through the story. If there's any backstory that gets revealed, when does it get revealed? Somewhere in the middle, after a certain event, during an event, before another event. So just go ahead and quickly write down all of the things that happen in your story. Okay, let's move on. So story and plot. Okay. This will be a little contradictory if you are writing screenplays because they've actually switched these terms. So that's a little confusing. But in craft, for writing purposes, for writing fiction, poetry, there's plot and story in poetry, and created nonfiction, we define these terms as follows. A story. A story is a series of events recorded in chronological order. So the outline that you just did, that in chronological order, is the story. It's the events that happen. Okay. An example is the king died and then the queen died. That's a story. They're just two events that happen in chronological order. First, one thing happened and then another thing happened. Plot is a series of events deliberately arranged so as to reveal their dramatic, thematic, and emotional significance. For example, the king died and then the queen died of grief. Okay, so let's mark the difference here. A story just is a series of events that have happened. There's no meaning to them, right? It's just a correlation in time. Whereas a plot shows cause and effect, right? You arrange the details so that meaning is carried with these events, not just events occurring. And summary and scene are methods of treating time in fiction. Okay, and we will talk about summary and scene. But when readers read, they're reading a series of summaries and scenes that make up the story as a whole. David Foster Wallace says the chopped off length of the tapeworm of time, a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence. A plot is also a narrative of events, the emphasis falling on causality. The king died and then the queen died is a story. The king died and then the queen died of grief is a plot. The time sequence is preserved, but the sense of causality overshadows it. Or again, the queen died, no one knew why, until it was discovered that it was through grief at the death of the king. This is a plot with a mystery in it, a form capable of high development. It suspends the time sequence. It moves as far away from the story as its limitations will allow. Consider the death of the queen. If it is in a story, we say, and then? If it is in a plot, we ask, why? So look through your outline real quick, the one that you wrote, and pick some, one event that's happened. And next to it, right, why? Why did that happen? Why did that event take place? And do a quick, 1 minute free write, or, jot down a few ideas of why did it happen? Not it happened because this happened before it, right? Go into the why of it. You can get philosophical, that's fine. Okay. So random events neither move nor illuminate. We want to know why one thing leads to another and to feel the inevitability of cause and effect in a story. So if you've ever told a story, you've heard this before, you'll be at a bar or you'll be hanging out with some friends and they'll tell a story, right? And they'll just say, oh man, I went to the store the other day and the clerk ran out of change, and so I had to go to the bank, and then I, go get the correct change, but then the bank was closed. But then I had to, I saw a friend, and I said, hey, can you break this change? They said, well, sort of. I can only give you half the money in change. So, and it goes. Maybe it's the story of this person who had to go all over town just so they could go buy, a Pepsi at the corner market. Why? Because they ran out of change at the corner market, and it was just a series of bad luck. That's a story, and it's not very interesting. People tell stories like this all the time, and then we go, oh man, that sucks, But in a short story and something that needs to be read, there needs to be why. Why did the Quickie Mart guy or woman behind the counter run out of change? Why did that happen? Why did this character go all over town just for a Pepsi? Right? Or a Coke. Why would they go to all these places to do all this? What does that say about them as a person or a character? Why do they desire this thing? Right? That is a plot. So to explain this or give you an example, here is one of my favorite poems by Billy Collins. You all know Billy Collins from earlier in the course. They animated some of his poems, and you may have seen this one. It's called In the Country or The Country, and there's a plot to it. So it's a short plot, but it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And note why things are happening. There's a variety of events that take place in this poem. And each of them they do build off of each other, but note the why they happen, not necessarily the what happens. Another way to think about plot is a chain reaction of disasters. This is a popular way of novel writing, believe it or not. So here's a thought experiment. Think of a hard time you went through in your life when all seemed lost, depressing, and hopeless. This could be a mistake you made, a hard decision with no positive outcome, something with or not within your control. Let's just say that a lot was on the line. So let's do a free write for 2 minutes. How did this event, from seemingly innocent, very uncomfortable, or even cataclysmic, set off the chain reaction to where you are now? Ready, set, go. Okay. So when we talk about a catastrophe or in plot, right, we're talking about tension. And tension in a story is what moves the plot forward. It's actually the reason the reader reads the story. Okay? When you're making the reader feel tense, when you're making the reader feel almost a little uncomfortable, right? That's what moves the plot forward, when you've put the protagonist in sticky situations that they have to worm their way out of. Okay, that's why people read. If that doesn't happen in a story, it's just boring. The reader has no reason to read it. Okay, so if we take the previous exercise you just worked on, you've started with a catastrophe, right? All the events that led up to this catastrophe. And that is creating tension in the reader to want to keep reading. So one way to drive the plot forward in your story is to create a series of events with two possible outcomes. Yes, but, no, and. Okay. For example, your goal, right, was to get a Pepsi at the corner market. but they ran out of change. There's no way you could get it. So that is an example of no and, right? Not only did you not get your Pepsi, and now you have to go run all over town in order to get, or now you have to go to the bank in order to get the change in order to go back to get your Pepsi. Now, if you go to the bank, right, in the next scene, you go to the bank, and yes, they are open, but they won't let anyone inside because of COVID, right? Note how because of the but, now you have to make another choice. Your protagonist has to make another choice. What are they going to do next? Okay, they'll go try a restaurant, right? Maybe they'll have the change. They'll just go on inside. So they go to a restaurant, but no, they don't have the change. And it's so early in the morning that nobody else is open. Oh, man, right? So then the person goes and sees a friend on the street, and they're like, hey, man, do you have change? I need to get my Pepsi. And they say, yes, I have change, but I actually don't have enough for the 20. I only have change for 10. So you would end up giving them like $10, right? Just for the change of 10s after you're giving them a 20 bucks. You see how this is moving plot forward, that events happen and the protagonist has to react, but it's never perfect, that it's never a yes and a yes. Yes, they have change. Yes, they get the Pepsi, because that would be boring. Okay, so review the cataclysm you experienced in the past. What led up to it? What chain reactions happened? Do they fit the yes, but, no, and pattern? It's like hyping up a sandy dune, and the plot moves forward one disaster at a time. Because the protagonist, or you in the cataclysm, didn't get what you wanted, something new had to happen in order to move you forward. And then it, ended in disaster of some kind. So what could go wrong? Everything. Everything goes wrong for your protagonist in a story. Tension can come from events, setting, other characters, and even characters themselves. Now imagine all the things that may happen to your character in their quest to achieve what they want. Who, what, where is in their way of getting their goal. Okay? So you don't want to just give your protagonist what they want right away. You have to delay that. You have to make them work for it. Okay? You have to, the events in the story, things happen to them that prevent them from getting what they want. Something in their setting, perhaps, where they live or where they are, can complicate what they want. Other characters get in their way. They themselves, as people, might get in their way of getting what they want. Sometimes people or writers will design plots around like a versus kind of thing, where it's them, the protagonist, against something specific. And yes, other things will be involved, but sometimes there's a theme, right? And some people really like these stories. For example, how might the world or setting be an obstacle for a protagonist? Well, that is the plot to a zombie apocalypse story or The Walking Dead. Right? The world and the setting has changed, and now the protagonists have to battle their way through this world of zombies, right? The world that they knew is gone, and they have to learn how to fight in this new world or survive. How might other characters be an obstacle? So this is a very popular one, right? Harry Potter, for example, it's Harry versus Voldemort. It's a specific character that represents, the ultimate protagonist, the villain, okay? How might society be an obstacle? So, a story where someone has to, break the chains of oppression, things like that. That would be society is getting in the way of, what the protagonist wants. How might the character themselves be an obstacle? This is where the character is their own worst enemy. They are both protagonist and antagonist. There's one of my favorite stories. They turned it into a movie called Sideways. That is an extremely good example of a character who they themselves are their own worst enemies. Okay, they essentially are the thing that's in the way of what they truly want, and they have a really hard time figuring out how to overcome their own issues. Another really great example is Breaking Bad. Walter White He is a character who he is himself his own antagonist, right? He descends into darkness, but it's all his own choices that really do it. The only one person to blame is himself. So let's do a little activity, and you have your pen and paper ready. I'd like you to draw this chart. This is a plot diagram. It's essentially just a triangle, right? And it represents rising and falling action in a story. Because as a reader progresses through a story, the tension has to slowly increase, okay? So go ahead and write down, maybe you get a little stick figure of your character, your protagonist, or write down their name. And then at the top of the diagram, write down their desire. And again, their desire does not have to be something tangible, although it could. Piece of candy, Pepsi. That might be a little trite. You might want to pick something a little bit more significant, right? But again, it doesn't have to be physical. It could be, love. They want to be loved, right? And then there has to be something that represents that desire. They want to love, the next door neighbor, right? So that person, their next door neighbor, represents the goal that would achieve their desire of love. But just to have love without something to achieve, without something physical to achieve, would kind of fall flat, right? So pick a desire for your character and, write it out on the diagram. Next, write down or fill in this chart, okay? Blank is a blank who blank, like we did in the last activity. In this example here, let's do Cinderella to illustrate how you'd fill this out. So Cinderella, we all know this story. It's actually one of the stories that almost all cultures around the world have a version of, believe it or not. And in this American, style of Cinderella, if we fill out the chart, it's Cinderella is a young woman of marriageable age who what does Cinderella desire? Now in class, when I'm, teaching students this plot diagram, people actually have a hard time figuring out what Cinderella wants. What is her main desire in the story? So take a second, try to figure out, what does Cinderella actually want in her story? What is her ultimate desire? Her desire was not to be loved. Her desire was not to get her house back. Her desire was to go to a party. That was it, right? She had these other desires, sure, they're under the surface, but the main desire, the thing that she had to work for to achieve, was to go to a party she had been invited to, okay? It was that simple. Now, note how there's going to be a variety of different catastrophes or a variety of different events that prevent Cinderella from getting what she wants. It's a mixture of setting, character, society, and even herself. Okay, so the first thing that happens is this is exposition, what you call exposition. It gets the story started. It establishes the reader in time and place, okay? And that is Cinderella. Her mother died, her father married, and then that was her stepmother, and brought two stepsisters into the marriage. The moment the father died, this is the American style, by the way, Disney, essentially. So the father dies, and Cinderella is left alone with her stepmother and stepsisters, and the stepmother is a bully, and so are the stepsisters, and they essentially turn Cinderella into a maid or a slave, okay? And she has to do everything that they say. Well, one day there is a invitation that shows up at the house, and all the girls of marriageable age in the kingdom are invited to a ball because the prince is looking for a wife. And of course, Cinderella, who is of marriageable age, also gets an invitation, or at least she's included in the invitation. And she says, well, I should be able to go. Well, you couldn't just say, okay, okay, Cinderella, you can go. And she gets to go and she dances with the prince and she gets to be the queen. That would be boring. That would be a really boring story. It would end in no time at all. What you want to do is you want to put something in her way so that she can't get what she wants. In, a plot that uses the catastrophe method of the yes, but, no, and, this would be a yes, but event. The stepsisters and the mom says she can't go. Okay. Yes, you were technically invited, but I'm just going to use my authority as stepmother to say no. Right. So, how does she overcome this? Well, she brings in a technicality. Cinderella's like, yeah, you see, I can't go. But really, it does say all single eligible women of marriageable age. You can't argue with, royalty. Right? She doesn't quite say that she's going to turn her stepmother and stepsisters in, but she does use, a little bit of fear, right? That, the kingdom or the king and the queen, they are in charge. They could technically get in trouble for not letting her go. The next thing that happens is that the stepmother and stepsister say, well, you can't go because you don't have a dress. Right? And so Cinderella says, oh, okay, well, I'll do a dress. And she makes a dress, but she makes the dress with the help of the animals. Note how in Disney, almost all of the significant events come with a song. So a little song plays, she makes the dress, and the animals help her, right? So no, she doesn't have a dress, but she makes one. Stepsisters then rip up the dress, right? Note how having a dress is not enough. Okay, so she has the dress, the stepsisters rip it up, and now she can't go to the ball. At this point in the story, and this is a very simplistic story, it's a fairy tale, it's a style of story that it's not as sophisticated as the one you will be writing for this class. But just note that Cinderella cannot overcome this on her own. At this point, if she doesn't have a dress, that is she could still go, I guess, but the story doesn't really allow that. The plot doesn't include that as an option. The stepsisters rip up the dress. She can't make another dress in time in order to go. Okay. So at this point, she is completely, it's impossible for her to move on, which is why divine intervention takes place. Okay. This is why the fairy godmother appears, because she herself cannot do it. Okay. No, she doesn't have another dress to wear, but fairy godmother shows up to hook her up. Okay. And then in this sense, the fairy godmother actually predicts the next few obstacles that are going to happen and covers them. She goes, you know what? This is going to happen. You don't have a ride, right? Okay. I'll give you a ride. Right? You don't have anyone to drive it. Okay, I'll make coachman out of the mice. And then you can go. But then the thing is, essentially, if the fairy godmother at this point took care of everything without any clauses, essentially the whole story would just be about a dress, right? About getting a dress. So we have to keep the plot moving forward. Okay. So the fairy godmother says, yes, I will hook you up and help you out. And then you'll have a new dress and you'll, have a coach and you'll be able to go to the ball and dance. But I am going to throw in this little caveat about midnight, and you have to be back by midnight. The fairy godmother comes from a concept in ancient Greek plays called Deus ex machina. Which you may have heard that before, which pretty much means God from the machine. And their plots, they were very good and complicated, but strangely, a lot of the plots in these very ancient plays would have an element like a fairy godmother kind of tie up everything in the end of a story. We don't, our contemporary audiences don't appreciate that. We would think it's lazy writing, but back then that was okay. But the term comes from literally a machine that the Greeks made. It would be like, a pulley system or something, and then they would swing out a god at the end of a story going, look, it looks like the protagonist cannot fulfill the very end of the story. So a god will appear and they'll just, on a pulley system or a rope, swing out a god onto the stage, and the god will make everything however they want it. Okay, that was very common in their stories. In fairy tales, this happens. But in your story, you don't necessarily want a god in the machine because readers will think that's lazy writing, and then they're invested in a certain plot and they want to see a character get out of it, right, or get out of a scenario or figure something out, and then you cheat them by putting in a fairy godmother. So don't put in a fairy godmother. Okay, but just note how this yes, but, no, and method works to move the plot forward. It looks like the protagonist never gets what they want, but it does move them forward through the plot as they try to figure out how to get what they want. And she does eventually get to go, but midnight gets in the way to move the story forward, and then there is this thing called a significant detail that comes back. And this also helps move the plot forward. The significant detail of the glass slipper, takes place earlier, right? Where, fairy godmother gives her glass slippers. Why? I'm not sure. And then later, she loses the slipper, and that becomes a important part of the story. So that's what we call a significant detail. If the glass slipper was never mentioned earlier in the story, then the readers again would feel cheated because they're like, well, where did this glass slipper come from, and why is it so important later? So if there is some kind of event or a thing that's said, or an actual, object like a glass slipper, if it becomes important later in the story, make sure you plant it earlier in the story so that readers know where it came from, and it just doesn't surprise them in the end. Okay. Now it's your turn. Write a quick outline of all the significant events that happen in your story. So you've got a list from the earlier free write, okay? And then plot the course of the events in order of tension, right? Make sure that they rise in tension, right? You can use the yes, but, and no outline method, or you can just, go, okay, well, this is more intense than the next, right? As the plot moves forward, the events that the protagonist has to overcome are harder and more difficult as they move along. Okay. After you are done with that, you can start this part of the lecture. We're going to talk about the difference between scene and summary. So it's not just what happens in the story, but it's how the story is told. How do we tell stories that readers will want to read? What makes a story? Okay, so summary. You will summarize in stories, and it's all linked to time. Okay, a summary covers a relatively long period of time in a relatively short compass. So a summary is where you don't go into detail about what's happening, what the protagonist necessarily feels or what exactly people are saying in time. Time speeds up. You could summarize years at a time in a story. In one sentence, you could say a few years later. And no, in one phrase, you have, time traveled 3 years or whatever to an event in a story. And why do we use summary? Well, it gives information that the reader might need to know. It fills in characters' background. It lets us understand motives of a character. It alters the pace of the story. You don't want to write a whole story in one scene, right? Because that would tire out the reader. It creates a transition, and it leaves moments of years. A story that has been told in one long scene, if you would like to compare scene to summary, it was that movie about World War I that they came out with, and it was one long scene. They didn't turn the camera off, and the protagonist, he's a scout, and he has to warn the troops across the countryside about some, invasion or trap, and he just goes and goes and goes, and there is no break. There's no scene break. The camera does not stop rolling as it follows him on his adventure. That is a movie told in one scene, which I don't know of any other story that does that. In your short story, I don't want you to do that. I want you to practice all the elements we're discussing. So make sure you include some summary in your story. Alternatively, a scene. A scene deals at length with a relatively short period of time. Okay? Scenes are necessary to fiction. You can't tell a story in summary. Okay? It's the means that allows readers to experience the story with the characters. This is where you feel like you are there with the characters as they are experiencing the world. You too are experiencing the world as the character does. It's confrontation and change that requires scene. So anytime there is a significant confrontation or the protagonist has to change in some way, there needs to be an event. Think about all the catastrophes or the bad things that happen to your character that they have to overcome throughout the story, right? Now, if Disney were to turn that into a movie, if they animated your story, what would they attach songs to? Ask yourself that. That every song essentially would be like a scene in your story. Okay, so here's an example of a summary. He remembered the letter she'd written him last summer. She'd given it to him on their last date and after he drove her home. She'd said she never wanted to see him again. He still had the letter tucked under his shirts in a drawer. Okay, so that's a summary of what happened. Here is a scene. She was quiet as he drove her home. He parked by the curb in front of the yellow house with its overgrown lawn. She reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope and handed it to him. "Read it later," she said. The car door squeaked as she got out. Note the difference between summary and scene. Even the summary, I'm just going to toggle back for a second. Note how the summary still has, clear imagery in it. We can see the letter tucked under shirts in a drawer. At least that, summary doesn't necessarily mean vague writing. You'd still need to include, the five senses if you can. But here, note the time difference, right? This is one specific moment. We are zeroed in time. And this scene could have lasted, I don't know. He drove her home, so that took a while. And so maybe it took 10 minutes, right? And then the part where she has to speak, right? That slows down time even more, where we're zeroing in on something that's happening right away. Whereas, I'm going to toggle back, here, years had gone by. Or months. Oh, it says she'd written him last summer. Okay, so a year, right? He's spanning the time of a year in a few sentences, whereas this is a very specific point in time. Okay, so here's an example of a summary and a scene. The snow finally changed to slush, then to water, which trickled down the hill of the bridge in two rivulets, one on either side of the path. The path itself turned to mud. The bridge was damp. It smelled rotten. The willow branches turned yellow. The skipping ropes came out. It was light again in the afternoons, and on one of them, when for a change Elizabeth hadn't run off, but was merely discussing the possibilities with the others, a real man actually appeared. He was standing at the far side of the bridge, a little off the path, holding a bunch of daffodils in front of him. He was a nice-looking man, neither old nor young, wearing a good tweed coat, not at all shabby or disreputable. He didn't have a hat on. His taffy-colored hair was receding, and the sunlight gleamed on his high forehead. Okay, now let's look at the difference here. The first paragraph is summary, and the second paragraph is scene, okay? In the first paragraph, it spans the course, I believe, of a year. The snow, well, not a year, but a change of season. The snow finally changed to slush and then to water, right? It was snowing, and then time went by, and the snow melted, okay? The bridge was damp. It smelt rotten, and the willow branches turned yellow, right? The skipping ropes came out. A skipping rope, if you skip rope, is what little kids do, right? So it had snowed, right? Everyone's staying at home. It turned to slush and then to water, and then everything was muddy. So the snow has completely melted. The weather has changed. It's nearing spring. Okay. And the little kids are coming out with their skip ropes. And then it was light again in the afternoons, right? So time has moved forward. And then on one of them, it was during this time that the protagonist hadn't run off, but was merely discussing the possibility with others, a real man actually appeared. That's all summary, right? It spans a long period of time, and it all, and I will talk about this in a moment, how it moves from summary to scene. This last sentence orients us down so that we know exactly where we are when the scene takes place. Then we have the scene. There's this guy standing on a bridge, a little off the path, holding flowers, and then a description of the man, right? So it goes from, a season changes to, okay, now we're on the bridge right there, staring at this man. Okay, so again, summary setup for a scene. You orient with a summary, then move to scene. Okay, so when you are going to write a scene, note that the reader needs to know what's going on, right? Where are they? You want to position them in time and place. Okay, and so here, yes, the snow finally changed to slush and then to water. And then, the path itself turned to mud. That time is sped up very quickly to span the course of a season. But then as the paragraph moves, it gets more specific and it starts to narrow down and slow time, right? Okay, we're going to focus on the protagonist. We're going to reveal where she's at. She's on a bridge, right? As things slow down, it reveals, or it narrows us down into exactly when the scene takes place so that it can kick off. So how much time passes in the first sentence and the second? When are we? Where are we? What details reveal this? This is an omniscient, limited point of view. We'll talk about point of view next week. Essentially, it is from the point of view of Elizabeth. It is limited to her point of view, okay? But it's omniscient in that, it's like a narrator, a godlike character who knows everything that she's thinking, okay, and feeling and seeing. So it uses Elizabeth as a girl, so it would be she, refers to Elizabeth as she and Elizabeth. It doesn't use the I, which would be first person. How does Atwood set up the scene that follows in the last sentence of the summary, right? So think of a summary when you're leading up into a scene as kind of like an upside down triangle, right? It starts broad in time, but then it narrows us down in time and place so that we're prepared for the scene, okay? And here is the scene. It's the here and now. Readers are here now seeing it as the character sees it. The scene is introduced when an element of conflict and confrontation occurs, right? There was no conflict or confrontation when the snow was melting, right? And the seasons were changing. I mean, a few months may have passed, right? But there's no conflict or confrontation. And so it's, the reader doesn't need to dwell on that kind of stuff. But when there is a conflict, that's when the scenes happen, okay? The story utilizes the following strategy. It's a summary leading up to and followed by a scene that represents a turning point for the protagonist. Okay, so review your plotted diagram of your story's events. Decide what you think should be a scene and what should be a summary. Okay, scenes are events that represent conflict in a character's life, which will result in a turning point in the story and should be in scene. They will reveal the character changing as a result, right? A summary is just a mode to heighten and or get you from one scene to the next. One could argue that a story or a short story or a novel is just a series of scenes connected by summary, okay? And so if you think of it that way, what deserves to be a scene? What does the reader need to be here and now for? Right? At any time that protagonist has to overcome something in the plot, you need to make it a scene so that we can experience the tension that the protagonist feels. Then you speed up time to get us through, whatever we need to get through, so the protagonist can then go through another scene, right, overcoming the next obstacle. So go ahead and go through your diagram and see what might become scene and what might become summary. Okay, so we're going to move on. There are versions or different types of scenes and summaries and stories, right? There are a backstory, or you might be familiar with the prequel, like Star Wars had prequels. It's essentially the backstory, okay? So our backstory is any information about the past. Whatever has occurred before the plot begins, but is necessary to make the story coherent. Since information can be revealed in dialogue, or in a character's thoughts, or in the narrative itself, or in summary, okay? Brian Clems from the Complete Handbook of Novel Writing says, including backstory in the opening pages is the same as saying to the reader, hey, wait a minute, hold on. Before I tell you the story, first there's something about these characters in this situation that you need to know, okay? I'm not saying you necessarily need to have a backstory. In fact, some people believe, or some writers think, that starting with a backstory is a bad idea. They think if that's where the story was starting, why not start it there? Right? And since we want to start in medias res, you may not want to start your story with a backstory. Okay? But you can use a backstory in either a summary or a scene if you wanted to include one. Here are two examples to show you a backstory. Staying long? Asked the receptionist. 2 days, maybe 3, said Frank. I've got to be back in London for my daughter's birthday. Family man, huh? 2 boys and a girl, he said, and a wife somewhere in France sleeping with a kid half her age. Okay. Note how this author slipped backstory into that last line. It came out in dialogue. A backstory doesn't have to have its own plot, right? It doesn't have to have, a whole scene included for it, a whole paragraphs of description. It could just be a line, okay? Or, family man, huh? Frank took his key and started up the stairs. He could have told the lady that he had 2 boys and a girl back home who were missing their daddy like hell, and a wife somewhere in France sleeping with a kid half her age. But he really wasn't feeling chatty right now. Okay. So both of these include the same backstory, but do so in different ways. One is more snarky. He's not afraid to share these details and probably doesn't care if he makes the person behind the counter who's, the receptionist, he doesn't necessarily care if, she feels uncomfortable with this information, right? This oversharing. Whereas in the other one, he does. He's a different protagonist. And he's stewing in his head, and we get to know his thoughts and feelings. And in this way, these backstories were included in either summary or scene. Okay, so again, a warning about backstory. Be careful. It's best to weave the background information within scenes and dialogue and through action. Long, drawn-out backstory can drag your story down and tempt your reader to put your story down. Okay, so you flitter some backstory in when you need it, but you don't just write whole sections of backstory, especially in a short story, because you only have so much time. Okay, now a flashback. Flashback is the narrative actually travels back from its current action to depict the past in scenes. So you're not doing info dumping you don't want to info dump anyway. That info dump is when you put too much backstory in, or you build your world in, long paragraphs, and that will bore the reader, right? You want to weave it into the story that you're telling. But a flashback is like a scene. It's like, you're still telling the story, and it's an actual scene, and we're there and now, but it's something that happened in the past. Okay. Here is a scene, which is a flashback from Susan Collins's The Hunger Games. Peter Millark. Oh no, I think, not him. I try to convince myself it doesn't matter. Peter Millark and I are not friends, not even neighbors. We don't speak. Our only real interaction happened years ago. Note how that's kicking off a flashback. He's probably forgotten it, but I haven't, and I know I never will. On the afternoon of my encounter with Peter Millark, the rain was falling in relentless icy sheets. Note how she's using a very similar method to Margaret Atwood, right? It's like an upside down triangle. It starts vague, or it starts, in time in her head, but then it narrows the time and place. It's on an afternoon with Peter Millark. The rain was falling in icy sheets. We knew this happened in the past, and then it was raining. Now that we're there, the story continues. I passed the bakers. The smell of fresh bread was so overwhelming, I felt dizzy. I lifted the lid to the baker's trash bin and found it spotlessly, heartlessly bare. Now we're there. Now we're real, like time has slowed down. We are with Katniss, and she's opening the trash bin and looking inside, and she feels sad. And then suddenly a voice was screaming at me, and I looked up to see the baker's wife telling me to move on. And I did. I want her to call the peacekeepers and how sick she was of having those brats from the seam pawing through her trash. The words were ugly, and I had no defense. As I carefully replaced the lid and backed away, I noticed him, a boy with blonde hair peering out from behind his mother's back. Here you go. So that is backstory, but told in a scene, and that's what we call a flashback. So go ahead and review your rising and falling plot diagram. What might the reader need to know about the character in the gaps between plot points? What event might you reveal in backstory, like details revealed through dialogue, description, and thoughts? What event might you reveal in flashback? What happened in the character's past the reader must experience in a scene? It could be that neither of these will occur in your story, and that's okay. But you can include a backstory and or a flashback in your story. So how to start a flashback. The connection between what's happening in the present and what's happening in the past will often best transport the reader. And again, it is a very similar strategy from summary to scene. Okay, only because this one deals specifically with going back in time, you have to orient the reader as to when this took place and where. Lieutenant Cross remembered touching the left knee. Okay, note how what's in bold is the memory or the significant detail that kickstarts the flashback. Lieutenant Cross remembered touching the left knee. A dark theater, he remembered, and the movie was Bonnie and Clyde. All right, so we're connecting. Why is this protagonist thinking of the past? Because he remembered touching the left knee. I'm not sure what that's in reference to, but it's something physical. He might be in another movie theater, right? Touching somebody's knee, maybe a girlfriend or a boyfriend, okay? But just doing that throws him into the past. Right? He's in a dark theater and he was watching Bonnie and Clyde. And Martha wore a red tweed skirt. And during the final scene, when he touched her knee, she turned and looked at him in a sad, sober way that made him pull his hand back. But he would always remember the feel of the tweed skirt and the knee beneath it and the sound of the gunfire that killed Bonnie and Clyde. How embarrassing it was. How slow and oppressive. Okay. So note that a short story of 5 pages or less has a limited number of scenes. Okay. The art of the short story is brevity, being concise and efficient, yet artful and powerful. This is the short story as an art form. So avoid too much backstory or flashbacks at the start of a story. Beginning should drag the reader into the drama happening currently in the character's life, and it wants to do so as soon as possible so that we can kickstart the plot. Okay. Janet Burroway says, when intrusive passages of childhood, motivation, and explanation tend to come early in the story before we are caught up in the action, we wonder whether there is any story on its way. Dialogue, brief summary, a reference, or a detail can often tell us all we need to know. And when that is the case, a flashback becomes cumbersome and overlong. If 4 pages into your story, you find there is more action happening in the character's memory than in the present action taking place, you may not yet have found where the story lies. So again, you want to start in medias res. The reader will catch up. The reader will figure out what's happening as the story progresses, but you don't want to fill them with tons of backstory so that they finally will understand what's happening because they'll just put the story down. right? You want to start them in the action, and then throughout the story, weave in bits from the past as they become relevant. Okay, so here's an activity. This is a song. You may have heard it. It's a famous song. It's called Fast Car by Tracy Chapman. Okay. You can either just play this the video, or you can read the lyrics, or both. The singing and the video really add pathos to the song, although the song by itself is already pretty sad. But note how it tells a plot. Okay, it has a plot. There are a series of events. There's a protagonist with a desire. There's scenes. There's backstory. There's motivation, right? So this is actually a really cool song because it's got all of the elements of a story. So for this activity, I'd like you to fill out the chart here. Name is an adjective, year-old, person who wants and desires what. So while you watch this video, fill out that chart. Jot down what her goal is. What is the protagonist's goal in this song? What is her unconscious desire? And how do you know? Right? That's the key. It's not enough to give a character desire, but you have to reveal to the reader what that desire is. So look at how Tracy Chapman did it in her lyrics. How did we know what she wanted, or what the protagonist wanted? Does she do it through scene, backstory, or both? Is the protagonist a motivated protagonist? So that is another element. Your protagonist has to really want what they want and to do almost anything to get it. If the protagonist is not motivated and they easily give up, nobody wants to read that story. Nobody likes lazy people. If your protagonist is lazy, then the reader doesn't want to read your story. So you have to make your protagonist motivated so that they're willing to tolerate all of these disasters in order to get what they want. So is this protagonist in this story motivated? And I'll tell you that, she is, right? The protagonist is very motivated in her story in this song. But ask yourself, how do you know? How does the author or the singer show you this motivation? Plot out the story of what happens in the song. What happens? Compare the story in the plot. Compare the events that take place in chronological order, and then figure out the why behind them, and how do the lyrics answer that question of why. Does this character have contrasting qualities? Okay, how do they play out in the story? So that is an element we didn't talk about very much. But one trick to make your protagonist seem more like a real person, like somebody that's interesting, is to give them contrasting traits. Okay, this is the problem with DC movies. If you've watched any DC movies and you're watching Superman or Batman, Batman's a little bit better, but Superman, for example, is a complicated character because he has no complication. He is a good guy, and that's it. He's super strong. He's a good guy. He doesn't have a lot of flaws. Okay? If you don't have a lot of flaws, what does he have to overcome? Well, he just overcomes the villain every single time. And that gets boring, right? He doesn't have a lot of internal conflict he has to deal with, which could be why he has a love story, right? It's not easy for him to get Lois Lane, right? So at least there's some story there, but that's not really a lot. Whereas in Marvel movies, there's a lot of contrasting qualities in the characters there. Tony Stark, he's kind of a jerk, and he's rich, and he's privileged, but he's brilliant. He is extremely smart, and when put to the test, he's actually quite loyal, right? Know how he has contrasting qualities. Right. So if you give your character contrasting qualities, you have to put them in situations where they're put to the test and they emerge, and readers love that. And they make it seem like real people because we ourselves have contrasting qualities. Okay. Does this protagonist get what she wants? in the end of the story of this song? Yes, no, or maybe. I hope you enjoy this song. It's one of my favorites. Okay. Oh, I'll have to fix this link. So, backstory and flashback. This is a scene or a series of scenes and stories and flashbacks from the beginning of Lord of the Rings. Okay, so I will link the YouTube video for you to watch on Canvas. So essentially, it's just the opening scene. It takes about, I believe, 15 minutes. Okay. In this scene, note how the narrator tells the story, right? There is an actual narrator. They themselves are a character in the story, but you don't find out till later. Okay. Note how the narrator is silent and the backstory is told through scene, what we would call a flashback. Okay, then note how the narrator is silent all the way through a scene. So note when there's a summary and note when there's a scene. When there's a summary, the narrator is speaking, right, to orient us to what's happening. But the moment the summary ends and it goes to scene and time slows down, right, and we're there and now, the narrator will stop speaking and we start experiencing the story. This is another strategy, you know, when you're debating whether or not you need to use scene or summary, just know or just think, okay, I'm going to include a scene here. Will my reader think they're hearing a narrator at this point? If a narrator is speaking, the reader may not feel like they're in a scene, right? So you need to make it more specific. You need to slow the time down, right? But if the reader hears a kind of narrator in their head, it could be the main character or the omniscient narrator, then you're probably writing a summary. Okay. So when you end a flashback, how to stop it, right? Sometimes you get lost in there. Maybe it's a short flashback, but you got to get us back into the present. So this is a lot like time travel, right? You're in the present, you go back in time, and then you jump back to the present. So when you end a flashback, make it clear you are catching up to the present again. Repeat an action or image that the reader will remember belongs to the basic time period of the story. Often simply beginning the paragraph with now will accomplish this reorientation. For example, when we were learning about the lieutenant in the previous example, Lieutenant Collins, I believe his name was, he was touching somebody's knee, right? It threw him backwards when he was probably with an ex-wife or girlfriend watching Bonnie and Clyde. If he were to end that flashback, it might come back to the knee in the present day that he is touching. Okay, so think of it like an anchor. You need to come back to a specific detail or something to reveal to the reader that you have traveled time, but you are now back. So you can tell that story as it's happening in the present. Sometimes just using the word now will be enough, but it just depends on, what's going on in your story. Okay. So that is the lecture for today. There's a bit of some technical elements, right? Writing a story or a successful story isn't just about writing, just writing and then and then and then. You have to kind of construct it. There's a lot of behind the scenes revision of when events take place and when they don't. How do you make sure that the reader knows that we're entering into the past, right? How do we make the reader feel like they're part of the story and they're experiencing things like the character? That's a scene, right? When you go into scene, when the character is, reacting to a conflict of some kind where they're going to change. When do you summarize? When you're trying to get them from one conflict to the next.